every Saturday from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. on Spreaker.com. It's time for
Rastafari Revelation, a 1-hour talk show produced and presented by members of the Rastafari Alliance for Science, Technology, and the Arts.
coming to you live from the United Kingdom with news, views, reviews, previews, and interviews exploring the Rastafari movement. Rastafari Revelation, produced and presented by members of the Rastafari Alliance for Science, Technology, and the Arts, in collaboration with www.spreaker.com, the
The World Wide Web's #1 podcasting platform.
Again, we're back, and we want to thank Ross Albert for sharing with us before the break his personal testimony. Ross Albert, would you continue with that? And also, on our last episode too, you went into some detail about the history of the Rastafarians in Jamaica. What I'd like for you to do is blend in and tell us about the Rastafarians in Dominica. And also, if you can see, I see that you've got a book, Dread Rastafari in Ethiopia. You've got some stories to tell. So tell us, what is this book about? And blend it in. Tell us exactly what is Dread.
Dread. Dread is a very powerful word. Dread is mentioned in the Bible a number of times.
Yes.
And it also means fear. It means respect.
Yes.
It means awesomeness. You know, you can refer to God as being the Almighty Dread.
Yes.
You know, and the dreadlocks was sanctioned by number 6, in that when a certain member would take on the vow of a Nazarite, he would let his dreadlocks grow long, and the sight of the dreadlocks is also the sight of awesomeness. You know, so dread in the context of Dominica was tied in with our hairstyle, in that when they looked upon the dreadlocks, they said, that's a dread. Okay, so unlike in Jamaica, where the Rastafarians were named Rastafarians because they worship Emperor Haile Selassie, in Dominica you were dread because you are dreadlocks. Okay, and my book, Dread Rastafari in Ethiopia, is really a pilot project that I started a few years ago to document the history of the Rastafari movement in Dominica. In the 90s, as a freelance journalist, I had written a 3-part article of the same name, Dread Rastafari in Ethiopia, that dealt with the history of the movement in Dominica, which basically began in the late 60s or mid 60s during the Black Power era. You know, in Dominica there was a very strong interest in Black Power. A number of individuals who had been overseas to universities were influenced by certain ones like Carmichael and also Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and also the struggle that was happening in Africa at the time for independence. All these factors influence the young minds, and from the Black Power movement it kind of progressed into the Dread movement. As I told you before, the Dreads were very anti-social. They was really spurred on by the question of inequality.
Okay.
Part of the mission of the Dreads was to redistribute land from the bourgeoisie to the poor man, especially to the unemployed poor man that was in the towns. They saw it as an injustice that some people had so much, and whereas a lot of people had so little.
Yeah.
One of the proponents of the Dread movement was, as you know, was Desmond Trotter, and during that time, he became the victim um, of a state cover-up, in that he was accused of a crime, and he was accused for the killing of a white man, and this spurred the movement, the Dread movement, into further confrontation between the system or the Patrick John administration and themselves. But as time went on, Cabinda was exonerated during Hurricane David. He escaped from the prison along with a lot of other inmates, and he was finally granted his freedom. In the meantime, the Rastafari movement kind of drifted away from the dread misnomer, and began to accept the Rastafarian tenets.
Yes.
And the history in my book is very comprehensive. So what I'm doing right now, I'm just kind of skirting over the main aspects of the history of Rastafari in Dominica.
Well, I'd like to interject here because I'm going to quote just a paragraph from you that goes hand in hand with everything that you're saying. And I'm quoting this. I want to commend you on putting in words your vision. This is quoted exactly from Ross Abbott in his book, Dread Rastafari in Ethiopia, the definitive report on the Rastafari movement in Dominica. And he quotes, "My focus is primarily to illustrate this through citing historical records regarding the colony of Dominica as seen through the writings of plantation owners, colonial travelers, and abolitionist activists of the 17th to the 19th century, recounting firstly a description of the island as seen by early European settlers, and describing the horrors of the plantation society, hence the Rastafarians' outrage and instant calls for repatriation and repatriations to slave descendants," unquote.
Yeah, and Tempe, you made a nice quotation there. To study Rastafarians in general, but in Dominic in particular, is really to study the question of human rights, of humanism, of religion, of society. It's a very in-depth study. And at the time, the government did commission a group of persons to conduct a study of the Rastafari movement, which was called the DJ Commission.
Okay.
But the results were never formally published. But perhaps in another program, we'll be looking at some of the news items that cover the various aspects of that report. But Rastafarians in Dominica have come a long way.
Yes.
Recently, we had the African Liberation Day celebrations. Over the last 20 years, the African Liberation Day March has been reinstituted, and the government has come on board. And I think the government has promised to give the Rastafarian movement a couple of thousands of dollars to keep the African Liberation Day activities alive. So we had a number of activities taking place this year, as always. And it's looking very, very good for the Rastafari movement in Dominica. And if I might just stray a little bit and invite our listeners and viewers that if you have any information about the Rastafari movement in your part of the world and you'd like to share it with us here on Rastafari Revelation, do contact us via Facebook. You can leave a message for us, and we'll be glad to to share that with our audience.
And getting back into it, if you can see,
The comments up here.
if you can see Ross Albert's book, Dread Rastafari in Ethiopia, the definitive report of the Rastafari movement in Dominica, I think that you would be intrigued as well as educated to get yourself a copy. And before you take it on, Ross Abbott, I want to thank you for enlightening us of your education. And if I may, again, Mr. Mandela, we'd like to wish you a speedy recovery. If I may share, because you had mentioned earlier, one of the things too, and this is just to bring the connection back in, I'd like to share that one of the things that I have found just so much with the genealogy research, I don't know whether I mentioned it on our last episode, but in finding it, I found out that my fourth great-grandfather on my mother's side was born in Africa.
Yeah.
So this is a personal enrichment for me. And not only that, he was born in Africa in the year of 1788. And his son, which would be the third great generation, was born in 1808. And he was born in North Carolina, along with his mother being born in 1880 in North Carolina, which leads to my grandmother being born in 1912 in Alabama, and my mother being born in Alabama in 1933. And rest her soul, I know she would just relish on the idea of discovering this. She was born over 150 years from a part of her family that is documented born in Africa. So part of my personal research and connection, just like you, with your book and your want to share the beginnings of the Dreads in Dominica, what I'd like to do is do further research and find out about these slave ships. Now, I found out that the first slave ship that came into America was called the Desire around that time. And what I'm looking for is any information. So if it's anybody out there that knows anything about a slave ship coming in the port of the North Carolina, Virginia, etc. area, please let us know, because I am doing extensive research on that. As well as also, that brings me to another point that I've discovered. Slave names, Ross Albert.
Yeah.
Is I find fascinating. And part of the research, to my surprise, they said that most slaves, the names of African American as well as West Indians, were taken and derived from their slave masters. So it all comes into the question, what is our name really? Who are we?
Well, that's interesting, because if at all you read Alex Haley's book Roots, you would have realized, you would have searched that when he did his research and he went back through the names of his ancestors back to Africa,
Yes.
he found that the family name was Kunta,
Yes.
Kunta Kinte,
Yes.
you know. And if you can just for a while just kind of imagine yourself before you were taken from the shores of Africa as a slave, before you were captured by, whether it was by black traders, whether it was by whites, colonialists, but you would have belonged to a family,
Yes.
right? You would have had a language and a culture and a home, maybe children, parents, other relatives, you know. And that was the situation in Africa, because Africans had their civilization just like anywhere else in the world. Before the colonials came, they had their ways, their culture, their languages, they had their songs, they had their ways of worship, their ways of education, the different forms of initiation, how they, initiated their warriors or their adults. It was all very indigenous. You see, so before someone was captured as a slave, they would have had their name.
Yes.
They would have had their understanding of what the world was all about. But then the moment you were captured as a slave and then sold off
Yes.
in the Americas, you lost everything that was unique about you. You became the property of the slave owner. And like as you said earlier on, many of the slaves, in fact all of the slaves, were named after their slave masters. So I am Williams. I'm Ras Albert Williams, but that is not my true name. You see? And that is one of the reasons why some Rastafarians go all the way and change their names back to African names,
Yes.
because they know that these names that we carry, Alberts and Tempe, were given to us after slavery. During our parents were slaves or descendants of slaves, and we were named with Christian names and English names. You see?
In fact, let me take it back a little bit before that. I found the word patronymic, and patronymic is the word meaning that the name that was given to the majority of slaves during that time in America. And they said that the patronymic names had a majority of cases surrounding it. It was just not a name given to you. And can you mentally stop and think that you were a slave in America, and that your slave master's name was John, so you were given the name John? Well, let me tell you from my research, I'm finding it so very fascinating. In fact, I think I want to become a professional genealogist at some point. But let's take it back to John. In the reports and the records that I've seen, Ross Albert, it's amazing that in my mother's side of the family, there were so many Johns owned by the same slave master. Well, they took it a step further, and usually they would give the name, your surname was given to you based on the job that your slave master gave you to do. For an example, cotton. If your job was to go out there and pick cotton, then that became your last name, John Cotton.
Well, that is nothing unique to the transatlantic slave trade.
Okay.
Another thing you have to realize that slavery was actually a form of currency throughout the world.
Okay.
Okay?
How so?
Well, different countries, for instance, when the Romans conquered the Israelites, they made them slaves, and the Egyptians, they made them slaves. Whenever an army from one country would invade another country, they would make them slaves, And in the European countries, you had a system called serfdom, where the land would belong to a certain lord or noble, and everybody working on those lands would have to give, in fact, they'd be working on the master's lands, on the lord or the noble's lands.
Okay.
So they didn't own lands. So they had to give a certain tithe, or sometimes all of it, to whoever owned the land. And even when people began to work in the industrial age, you found that when persons worked for a certain employer, again, a lord or a noble or some sort of person like that, he could dictate to them who they could marry and where they could live and when they should work and when they should not work. You see, so the world has been evolving from a state of servitude, where you had kings and queens that control their subjects and lords that control their various communities, to a place where we're talking about now about democracy. But we have a long way to go. So getting back to the question of people taking on the names of their masters, even in the United Kingdom, a lot of people have names based on their occupations, and it just goes back to the industrial age, when people took names according to what kind of work they did.
Yes. Yeah.
So as you go back into studying history, you're going to find a lot of amazing things that because we've become so modern in these times that we're only thinking about the modern attractions that we have right now, like television, internet, and telephone, and mobile phone, and and things like that, and social media, and that's what's occupying our mind now. But if you were to go back into history, you're going to find a lot of amazing things. Before the industrial age, how people lived, how people worked, what their view of the world was. The reason why Columbus thought the world was flat and he could go just travel east and he would end up in the Indies. You see, so your history that you're studying now is very, very fascinating. But unless we study and share, the coming generation is not going to have any knowledge about the path the ancestors have been on. And actually, there's an African proverb that says that we are only as tall as we stood on the shoulders of our ancestors. Right? So, no matter how much we think that we are advanced and we are modern, we're only so modern because of the work that went into civilizations many thousands of years ago by our ancestors. And let me explain to you why that is so.
Okay.
Because before it was said that men were hunters and gatherers.
Yeah.
Okay? Men were wild. Men lived practically similar to the animals. But at some point in man's prehistoric mind, he must have realized that he has to build homes, so he has to find some sort of shelter.
Okay.
He has to find some sort of clothing.
Yes.
So the idea of we having clothes on us and having a shelter over our heads to protect our farms from the elements is all based to the wisdom of the prehistoric man in finding, reckoning that we need to have some sort of home, some sort of clothing. And then as man began to explore more and more, man invented implements, basically tools like bows and arrows and axes and plates, And on top of that, man began to experiment with fire. Fire was a very important discovery for man because with fire, man could cook food, and man could melt metal ore to make iron implements. You see, so when you look at these early discoveries of mankind, with all those discoveries, we would not have all the modern attractions we have today. The early motor car and all of that. The first vehicles, the first planes. If you go into the history of how these implements and these inventions were developed, you will see that it took very inquisitive minds to find out the science. If you look at, for instance, take trains. Before you had electric trains, you had steam engine trains. Where you had to pump in coal into a boiler and you had to heat up water, and the steam would run the pistons. Then we move into electricity. But electricity itself has a history that is fascinating. But anyway, I digress there.
No, you haven't digressed.
Yeah.
In fact, let me tell you something. What you have said, Ross Albert, I don't know whether the listeners are with us. I hope you are. But let me tell you something. Take yourself back mentally. That's all we ask is mentally. And for me, it is almost mind-boggling. But I'm trying to do what I have to do, and that's just what I have to do. But it's mind-boggling on every one of the reports that I've discovered and I've read. Two things, no matter what report I read, was asked. Could the slaves read or write? Now, what you said, Ross Albert, made me I'm trying to hold back tears and anger. Because I'm going to tell you, it's an emotion that it just evokes in me. How people could have been treated the way they were. And on many of the reports, it was zero. They could not read or write. You understand?
Yeah, well, like I said, they could not read or write English.
And they were not allowed to read or write.
Yeah, like I said, they could not read or write English you're talking about. But the slaves came from communities
Yes.
where they would have had some sort of language, some sort of even written or oral
But
language.
they had intercommunication.
Yeah.
Yep. They had a communication, and what I found fascinating is, you see, I'm not talking this about some distant book I'm reading about some other family. I'm talking about something that came down through the lineage of my own family. I remember stories from my mother telling me about some of these same people. In fact, Ross Abbott, before we go into commercial, my mother was one. Let me tell you, my mom now, bless her heart, um, did not, she only had an 8th grade education, I will share. But my mom was one of the most, the strongest, intelligent women in the world. She used to tell me about some of the stories, how she had to quit school and walk a couple of miles one way and back, and some of the conditions she had to go through. You understand? So the fact that she couldn't get the education never once took away from any of her being, any of her goals, her desires, her will to do. And I'm saying that because as a people, that is what we're about.
Okay, well, it's now 2 minutes going up on 3 o'clock. In fact, 1 minute according to my laptop. But we're going to have to wind down. Tempe, it's been a pleasure having you on the program for yet another week as my co-host.
Thank you.
And what we're going to do now, we're going to have to wind down because our time has come. And then you can hear it. It's now time to wind off on Rastafari Revelation for yet another week.
And get well, Mr. Mandela.
Yeah, let's keep him in our prayers that he's going to overcome.
And thank you, Spreaker.com. Thank you, Livestream Webcaster. Thank you to all of our members at Rastafari Alliance for Science, Technology, and Arts. Thank you, Ross
Every
Abbott.
Saturday from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m.
Rastafari.
Spreaker.com. It's time for
Rastafari Revelation, a 1-hour talk show produced and presented by members of the Rastafari Alliance for Science, Technology, and the Arts.
coming to you live from the United Kingdom with news, views, reviews, previews, and interviews exploring the Rastafari movement. Rastafari Revelation, produced and presented by members of the Rastafari Alliance for Science, Technology, and the Arts, in collaboration with www.spreaker.com, the
The
World
World Wide Web's #1 podcasting platform.
So this is more immediate, but this is delayed on Facebook.
Rastafari Revelation.
every Saturday from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. on Spreaker.com. It's time for Rastafari Revelation, a 1-hour talk show produced and presented by members of the Rastafari Alliance for Science, Technology, and the Arts. Coming to you live from the United Kingdom with news, views, reviews, previews, and interviews exploring the Rastafari movement. Rastafari Revelation, produced and presented by members of the Rastafari Alliance for Science, Technology, and the Arts, in collaboration with www.spreaker.com, the World Wide Web's #1 podcasting platform.
automatically saved on Spreaker.